Hi, I'm Jilly G. Welcome to my kitchen. Today I'm going to show you my pecan pie. And over the next few weeks or so for Thanksgiving, I'm going to be showing you all of my holiday favorite recipes, gluten-free of course. And they're all traditional Thanksgiving recipes, but we make them a lot here at my house. And I'm going to share them with you. Today is pecan pie, and I've got everything ready, but first up, I don't know if you can hear it bubbling, but I've got some butter over there melting on my stove. And before we do that, oven is preheated to 375. I have about 1.5 cups of pecans here. I'm gonna start toasting these while we start browning our butter. This is a 1/3 cup of butter, and I'm just gonna stir it around until the milk solids are browned. We're just making brown butter, and it will take a few minutes. And I just have this over medium heat. And I know it's hard to see with all of this foam, but you can see that it is starting to turn a golden brown at the bottom. Turn off your heat. I'm gonna set this right here while I check on the nuts. And those are ready too. So in the same amount of time as you need to toast your nuts, you can brown your butter. And I'm gonna put it in this dish here just so it doesn't keep cooking because this little pan is hot. And we can just set this aside. I don't know if you've ever made toffee before, but the smell of brown butter always reminds me of toffee. And because we toasted the nuts at 375, that's what our pie needs to bake at. So it's already ready to go. And these are just cooling off here. We'll cut those up in a little bit. So first up for the crust, I have a 1/3 cup plus 1 tablespoon of butter. You want the butter to be a little bit softer than right out of the fridge. It's just easier to work with a pastry blender. If you were gonna do this in a food processor, you could bring it right out of the fridge and have it ice cold, but this is fine. And I have 1 cup of flour, all in here, 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and 1 egg. We'll just crack this right now. And I've got everything else ready for the pie crust. So I've got this, I have my cold water in the fridge, extra flour for rolling, all of my utensils and rolling pin. I have a piece of parchment paper, a 9-inch pie dish, and some foil here so the crust doesn't get too brown. And this isn't a deep dish pie dish. It's just a regular standard 9-inch pie pan. So everything is ready. With my pastry blender, I'm gonna start cutting into my butter and my flour. And I know I've told you before, but a butter knife is one of the handiest tools to have in the kitchen. And when it gets to this point where you're almost there, I just kind of stir it around with my fork just to see what's happening. And once it looks like this, we're ready to go. And this looks really good. Move everything out of the way. Get this little bit that didn't make it into the bowl, or that flew out of the bowl. And with my same fork, I'm gonna mix up my egg. You could just use an egg white if you don't wanna use the yolk. If your gluten-free flour mix has xanthan gum, you don't need to add in this egg. I mean, of course you can if you want to. I'm gonna mix in the egg first, and then I'll start adding in my cold water. And once that's all mixed together, I'm gonna get my cold water. And I always start with a cup. I never use a whole cup, but you never really know. And you can see there's little bits of flour, but it's holding together pretty well. I'm gonna clean my fork off. And I'm just gonna start adding in a little bit of water at a time. And just mix it around. The weather here today is overcast, possible rain and snow, and you can see it really isn't taking very much extra water. When making pie crust, the weather really does make a difference. And if you're really not sure, you can always add extra water, but you can't take it away if you've put too much in. Then you'd have to add extra flour, and then it might not be the right amount for the butter that you've got in there. So just always start with less water first. So set that aside. Handy little bowl scraper here. Bring it together a little bit, even though we're going to be turning it out onto our parchment paper. I always bring my parchment to the edge and then I lean against it. And just bring it together. And then I just flatten it out just a little bit. Give it a head start before we start rolling. A little bit of flour, a little bit more flour, and start rolling this out. Keeping it moving. Adding extra flour as needed. You can even flip it over if you want to. And I always just feel it to make sure it's the same thickness all the way around. Bring over your pie dish, and that looks pretty good. So a little bit more flour, and I'm just going to very carefully roll this up onto my rolling pin here. Use the parchment paper to help you. And as I've mentioned before too, if it falls apart, which gluten-free pie crust usually falls apart, you just piece it back together. And mine's already falling apart. So what I'm gonna do, there's another way. You can just fold it in half. A little bit of flour. Fold it in half again. Bring over your pie dish. And then just pick it up, put it in 1/4, and then unfold it. And I usually put it down inside the pie pan before I start piecing it all back together, just to make sure that it's getting evenly around. And when you're piecing it back together, make sure it's still even thickness on the bottom and the sides. And then you can start turning your edges over. And if there's a little bit extra on one side, just take that off and put it aside for the next part. And this little bit here, we can put right here. But try to make sure that your edge is the even thickness all the way around, just so it cooks evenly in the oven. And once you've got your edges the way you want them to be, I have a little bit of pieces here with floured fingers. I'm just going to press this into the bottom where it cracked apart just to reinforce it a little bit. No one's going to see this part anyways once you get the filling in. And as usual, my favorite edging to make, if you need to, you can dip your fingers in flour. I always double check everything. And it looks really good. Set that aside. I'm going to clean everything up and then I'll show you the filling. I have a pizza pan lined with foil that we'll bake our pie on. And again, our other foil. And I'm not going to cut up my nuts just yet. I'm going to mix my other ingredients first. So in this bowl, I'm going to add my 3 eggs. And these are room temperature. So 3 eggs, just mix up. And I don't know about you, but there are so many variations on pecan pie. Who knew there were so many? But mine will be sugar-free, of course, but still sweet. And I've seen so many different recipes that use corn syrup or brown sugar, dark corn syrup, light corn syrup, regular white sugar. There's so many different variations, but this one is mine. And so to my eggs, I'm gonna add, let me get my spatula here for my brown butter. I have a half a cup of honey. And as always, I'll give you the equivalents to sugar. I also have a 1/3 cup of maple syrup in here. And if you don't want to use maple syrup, you could just use all honey in here. But the original recipe called for brown sugar, so I'm going to add in 1 teaspoon of molasses just to give it that little bit of a caramely flavor. I should have just poured it straight from the bottle instead of in this little cup. 2 teaspoons of vanilla, all in here, and a half teaspoon of salt. And just mix this around till the honey and the maple syrup are pretty well combined. Once you've got that all mixed together, add in our 1/3 cup of browned butter. Get all those brown bits. And mix this till it's really combined. It looks like caramel jelly. So set this aside. Bring over your nuts, and you could just add them in like this. I like to chop them up before I stir them into the filling, just so it's easier to manage when you're cutting a slice out of your pie. You don't have a big nut to cut through. So you can cut these as fine as you want. They're not all the same size, and that's fine. And that looks really good. So bring back your filling and just start adding in your nuts. I'm gonna switch. Actually, give this a really good mix. I'll switch to my spatula to stir these in. And just mix your nuts into your caramel sauce here. And let's just move this whole thing over here. Get your pie shell from the fridge. If you have a deep dish pie dish, you would just do 1 1/2 of this filling recipe, and it should fill up a deep dish pie dish. And this is going to be a pretty thin pie, but it's okay because if you put any kind of whipped cream or anything on top, then you can just put that on the top for when you're serving. So pour in your filling. And I just make sure it looks pretty even all the way around. And you can see how thin my filling will be. But this is a really rich pie. And again, you could fill this up with whipped cream when you're ready to serve. Or vanilla ice cream or whatever you prefer. So bring over your foil pieces here. And try not to mess up your edge when you're crinkling this around your crust here. That looks really good. If you had an 8-inch pie pan, this would fit almost to the top. But I kind of like it in a 9-inch pie pan. Then it is really thin, and then you'll have a small piece anyways, and it isn't overwhelmingly sweet. So into the oven. I'll check it at about 30 minutes and we'll see what we've got. If you were doing it in a smaller pie pan and it was thicker, you'll have to adjust your cook time to make sure it's done in the middle. And what we're looking for is to be just set. It's okay if it's a little wobbly, but just set. I don't know if you can see how puffy it is, but it really just barely is jiggling in the middle. I don't know if you can see that or not, but it looks really good. You see how nice and golden brown my edges are? You could have put an egg wash on your crust if you want to, but this is fine. And this went for about 45 minutes in the oven. Again, if you did a smaller pie dish and it was thicker, it'd probably go maybe an hour or so. But this will sink back down when it's cooled off. We're gonna let this cool off to room temperature and then stick it in the fridge. And then after it's been cooled off for a couple hours in the fridge, we'll cut into it and I'll show you what the inside looks like. My pecan pie has been cooling in the fridge for a couple of hours. It's ready to try. And I just have some whipped cream here. And even though I cut up my nuts pretty small, it still is a little bit challenging to get your knife in there. That's a really big piece. First one's always a little bit of a challenge to get out. Sure looks good. Turn that around so you can see. As I mentioned, it's a little short pie, and I have a lot of crust here, but if you just put your whipped cream on top, it's all right. Let's give this a bite. Get a little bit of whipped cream there. It's really good. This isn't a super sweet pie. Pecan pies sometimes tend to be really sugary sweet, but this one is really good. I don't know if you've noticed, but when you use less sugar or even different sugars, other flavors seem to pull through more. And that's what happens with this pie without using sugar and corn syrup. But it's really good. And my crust is really flaky. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.